Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple, I had to have you back. It's actually kind of a quick turnaround since what we had you back in June. And you've been taking the industry by storm. I mean, you were doing great things last time we spoke, but you're just coming off an appearance on Huberman. You've been everywhere. Your media has been great. And for those who haven't heard the previous episode, you have a PhD in integrative physiology, Master of Science in exercise science. You are the co-owner of Mass Research Review, and it's great to have you.
Thanks for having me back.
All right. So, wellness peptides, the biggest, buzziest thing in the industry right now is wellness peptides. And I've got a lot of people talking about it. Not too long ago, I had my friend Dr. Dwayne Jackson on. He's a PhD who studied peptides for a long time. And I was very picky about who I would bring on the podcast to talk about this. I've had other guests who I love who have been very loud and even endorsed peptides, but I didn't have that conversation with them specifically because I want to actually talk to people who understand the research, what's true, what's not. So how much human data do we actually have on what we'll call wellness peptides? Because there's the GLP-1 agonist medications and everything that's coming out the weight loss drugs aside, and maybe even define wellness peptides.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion because there are approved peptide drugs. Well, I'll start here. The body makes peptides. And so there's these shorter chains of amino acids. They work as these chemical messengers and they act fairly quickly. So, for example, you have an injury and you're getting a message to shuttle more blood flow to that area in order to heal. And that's like a tissue healing signal. Or you have a response of leptin and ghrelin, and they are kind of working together in the sense that the body sends a signal, and then the peptide either travels through the bloodstream from one organ to another, or it acts more locally, and so it's excreted from cells and then works on surrounding tissue in a local area. So these we make, and it's all very tightly regulated, and many of them are kind of function as hormones. But when we think about peptide drugs, these are either initially extracted from the actual endogenous peptide in an animal or a human, and then they're kind of chemically modified. It's really, really complicated drug science, but essentially one of the the active ingredient, semaglutide, the ingredient in Ozempic, Wegovy, etc., that we have GLP-1. We make GLP-1, but it lasts in the body for like 2 minutes. And so one of the structural changes that they've made to that drug that makes it so powerful is it lasts longer in the system. And that's why people do weekly injections. So these drugs are kind of chemically engineered in a variety of really complex ways so that they either stimulate like the body's production of a hormone. So instead of injecting yourself with growth hormone, you're injecting yourself with a peptide that is designed to increase your own growth hormone production,
Right.
or or it's designed so that these are upregulated in the system for longer. And a lot of the peptides in the wellness space are not approved. So we have approved peptide drugs. There are many, but we have a whole host of these drugs that are not approved and are being sold online, really heavily pushed online. It's funny that I actually got an email yesterday. I'm sure you get emails like this all the time from companies asking you to push their supplement or, an Instagram post, whatever. This one was from a peptide drug company, and they were saying, we're really trying to push this thing with a small group of creators in the hope that each will make a minimum of $20,000 a month, which was shocking to me because now not like there's a clear incentive, huge financial incentive for people to promote this stuff online. So I did a deep dive into the data because I knew it wasn't going to be compelling because these drugs aren't approved. And the FDA drug approval process is really extensive because you develop the drug and then you test it in rodents and then you apply for an application for approval to do human clinical trials. And the phase 1 trials are maybe like 20 to 80 people. And then there are phase 2 trials with hundreds of people, phase 3 trials with thousands of people. And the purpose of this is to make sure the drug actually works, make sure the drug is safe for short and long-term use, establish any side effects, make sure it's okay in different populations, assess any interactions between this drug and other medications that you might be taking. So it takes years and years, and the vast majority of drugs do not make it past a phase 1 clinical trial. So it's really important to underscore that because when you look at some of these popular peptides like BPC 157, they are own with the amount of human data that we have is shockingly slim. So you see widespread claims. I'll keep going with BPC 157 about recovery, right? So recovery from injury, recovery from surgery, gut health. There's a lot of big claims about this drug. And everything we know about it basically comes from the person who first isolated it, so that one scientist. And it does seem really impressive in these rodent models where they're basically deleting a gene from the rodent and breeding it and then injecting it with this peptide to see if it actually, does what it's supposed to do. And they've seen all these interesting results in terms of creating new blood vessels or increasing blood flow. And that would theoretically help promote healing. But this is also the same mechanism that feeds tumors. So let's say you have a very small undiagnosed tumor, and then you start creating all these new blood vessels, creating that would help you heal the injury. That could also metastasize your cancer. So it's sketchy and that needs to be investigated because we can't say, oh, this is safe for sure.
Hmm.
And when we look at the human data on BPC 157, there are two papers. One is a retrospective analysis of 12 people where the researchers called them and said, did your knee pain heal or did you feel better when you were getting those BPC 157 injections last year? And 7 of the 12 people said yes. So this is not very compelling data because you're just getting self-report. There's no control. You don't, there's no even standardization for what they were being treated for, like they just using the term knee pain broadly. The second paper is a research report of 2 participants or patients who underwent an acute infusion of BPC 157, and then they measured some cardiac blood biomarkers immediately after, and they said, oh, it doesn't look like there were any adverse reactions. And that's the only thing we know about this drug in humans.
Let's go back to the knee pain one. I mean, shit. There's so many explanations for why that knee pain would have resolved. I mean, there's just regression to the mean of like your experience of pain, like it heals. You have placebo effect, which is extremely potent. We don't know what kind of other physical therapy, strength training interventions they're doing, which we know those can also be very valuable too. So it's like, is it the peptide? Now, to all this, it makes me think, okay, well, some of these are not approved. Well, there are things that we know work really well that are either not approved or not legal, and it usually falls under the performance enhancing drugs umbrella. And of course, there often are side effects, and sometimes there are political reasons for these things being, disallowed as opposed to, maybe the science of it. These things can be very complicated. But in the case of these peptides, is do some of them is there any evidence outside of like what you just described that maybe they work, but they're simply just yet not yet approved, or there are other reasons why that we don't have broader access to them?
Well, in order for us to say this actually works and it's safe, then we need a fair amount of high quality research.
Mm,
You know, what to your point with the knee pain, there is some really interesting sham surgery studies where they
mm,
take people who need it's either an ACL or MCL repair, I don't know. But they did the surgery in one group and they just made an incision and stitched them back up in the other group. So they think they had the surgery.
mm,
And then everyone does the same physical therapy protocol post-surgery, and there were no differences, which is wild and a really interesting example of, the power of the mind and the placebo effect, and also of just doing the physical therapy.
mm. Absolutely. And I guess I'm not an expert in, I get questions all the time and I try to deflect them, but I'm not an expert in performance enhancing drugs, their pharmacology and their background and history. But I guess a lot of those drugs actually were developed and are pretty well understood as to exactly how they work, both on a mechanistic level and probably research data. It's just there are reasons why they're not legally available broadly for use. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. This is really the wild, wild west because the research is only in rodents, or
Mm,
maybe there was a drug trial that started, and it's usually for some other reason, right? That one of these peptides, there's two studies that supposedly were underway, human clinical trials, and then they never reported the data. They were shut down. And so you have to wonder what the hell happened there. Um, so we're looking at a situation where we don't really know that it works. It's all based on these kind of mechanisms. So, let's say we're using something that should or could or maybe does increase our natural production of growth hormone. The marketing around that is this will help you build muscle, this will help you lose fat. But we know that people who inject growth hormone have a whole host of unwanted side effects. And that's because you can't just say, hey, go to the muscle, right? And growth hormone regulates all these tissues, not just muscle or fat. And so if there are issues with people using growth hormone, then these growth hormone boosting peptides could be problematic in the same way. We just don't know. The other issue is that because they're not approved, there's no control over how or where they're manufactured. The issue with that is you don't know if it's dosed properly, you don't know if it's contaminated, you don't know if it's labeled properly. And so there's all these issues, even just with the sourcing of it, because they're only sold online as for research purposes only, or not for use in humans. That is really, really sketchy.
it's a way to get around it legally. Why do you think it's popular now? Did the development and popularization of the GLP-1 agonist medications and the new things that are coming down the pipe, did that kind of open the doors to everything else, or do you think it's being led within the bodybuilding sphere, which has traditionally been kind of the cutting edge? And this is one of the narratives that, well, they're ahead of the science, and they're the ones who are often testing and experimenting with this stuff. And perhaps if there's a voluntary understanding there, and those type of people are willing to make those trade-offs, which is pretty traditional in the competitive bodybuilding sphere. But maybe it is a bit of a proving ground to get more information to actually study it. But why do you think it's getting more popular? Or is it just there's so much financial incentive now?
I think the rise of GLP-1 use kind of normalized injecting yourself.
Okay.
Because I think in the past, people would hear about, oh, bodybuilders are, injecting themselves with testosterone, growth hormone, insulin, and it sounded very sort of shady and something that, the regular people wouldn't do. But now you have this normalization of injectables coupled with the term peptide, which is often marketed as natural because
Mm.
the body does make peptides. And so people aren't necessarily looking at these as drugs. They're looking at them as supplements.
Mm.
And I think that is allowing a lot of these wellness clinics to present them and sell them and pitch them to people in a way that sounds like, oh, I'm just getting, a vitamin infusion or something like that, as opposed to what it really is.
And do you think we will see more good quality research in humans? Actually, to the point you said about there's two studies that we never heard the results of. That's usually an indication that either something didn't go great or it was kind of a null result. They just didn't find anything. And oftentimes there's pressure for studies to show positive results, so you don't get the ones actually published if there's just no effect. Is that right?
Yeah, so if it didn't work in one scenario, then it's really unlikely to move forward. There's a peptide, CJC 1295, and that was in human trials for lipodystrophy and HIV patients. This is one of those kind of growth hormone boosting peptide drugs. And somebody died of a heart attack in that trial. And it's unclear, if it was the drug or not. But when something like that happens, the trial gets shut down. And typically, nobody wants to touch that drug anymore. Because in order to do this kind of drug investigation, a company has to come in and say, look, we're going to fund this and we want the we're going to name this something under our company, and you're kind of making a gamble that the research is going to work, and then you can make a lot of money. But when something goes wrong, then typically there's not a lot of incentive for a company to come in and like go through that process again. And there's so many of these out there that it's not like the scientists are going to say, oh, I really want to study this one if there's not a lot of indication that it would work, because you have so much that goes into a clinical trial. You want to be really careful and picky with what you pick. So from a scientific perspective, it's not a great bet if you have either no human data at all, or if the human data that you have indicates that it wasn't as successful, and certainly if there was any kind of adverse outcome, it's unlikely that someone would want to continue to study it.
I'll interrupt this episode for a quick but important side quest. While I don't think everybody needs to track nutrition all the time, tracking is one of the most powerful tools to make sure you're not eating too much or too little. And Macros First is my go-to app for me and my clients. Macros First has a free barcode scanner, and a premium version comes with a bunch of cool stuff to make managing your nutrition easier. Like, one, AI search. Yeah, AI is everywhere now, where you can speak or type the foods you wish to save and log everything without having to search for each individual ingredient. Two, import recipes from a website. Save time creating recipes manually by importing all ingredients and instructions from your favorite recipe websites. No more searching for each ingredient one by one, just paste in the website. And three, this one's a big one for nutrition coaches. Follow unlimited friends so you can follow all your clients. And there's a lot more cool features. You can try the premium version of Macros First free for 14 days. Just download Macros First from the App Store. And during setup, you'll be asked, how did you hear about us? Type in the code Andrew.
I think there's another narrative out there too. And if I understand the narrative correctly, it's that people will say that, well, these companies can't patent these drugs, therefore they can't profit from them, therefore they will not study them. Does that make sense? I believe that's a narrative, and yet I don't think that's true.
No, I mean, in order for the science to move forward, then typically these aren't just randomly studied. There's
Hmm.
an reason to investigate them, and there's a drug company that is incentivized to become Ozempic, right? So you're studying semaglutide, but then there is Ozempic, and that's where the money is made. But semaglutide has to be studied extensively in order for the brand to actually be successful. And there's not a lot of branding around these compounds, which is why they all have these letter and number type names.
And I would imagine, though, if a company was able to develop it, show that it worked, if the research was there, they could still patent, as I understand it, their formulation, their approach to it, their brand, and there still would be a lot of money if they actually worked really well. Like that's my logic.
Yeah, if I think if the companies and the scientists were really bullish on one of these compounds,
Mm.
there would be a lot of work underway to study them. But this whole kind of gray market online system is making people so much money because there's no regulation. So I can just order them online in bulk and start selling them to people in my wellness clinic or reselling them to people for at a higher price point online. And as long as you're careful around the language that you use, you can make it, you can really gloss over the fact that these aren't well studied and the claims are not supported by human research, and there are issues with potential, safety and contamination because there's no oversight.
Is there any likelihood that, the government bodies that oversee this would turn around and suddenly shut it all down?
Well, the FDA has tried to by saying that they weren't you're not allowed to make these in compounding pharmacies. That's one thing that the FDA did to try to crack down on this, and it didn't really work clearly
Mm.
because there are given like the public interest, it just seems like there's so much money to be made there, and the wellness industry is going to capitalize on that.
Mm.
And it's really kind of scary to see because what went from being like a biohacker thing and a bodybuilding thing, like a
Mm.
really niche, I feel like is on the cusp of being mainstream wellness.
Mm. And I mean, I always try to avoid like overt political, you know, anything with this stuff. But the current administration in the US, definitely the wellness community has definitely allied themselves with the powerful figures within government. So it probably doesn't seem like there'll be some changes anytime soon.
Yeah, I doubt it. And I think this will take off and continue to grow. If something catastrophic happens, then maybe that will shift the tides. But to be honest, I don't see how this continues without something bad happening at some point.
The thing it makes me think of is ephedrine. So quite some years ago, I know there was one particular notable. I don't know if he was a high school or college. I think it might have been college football player who was out in the heat of the summer running around, probably got dehydrated, but it was using ephedrine and died. And I think there was a few deaths related to ephedrine. And who knows? Like, I mean, was it the ephedrine causing it? Was the fact that it was a very large human, overworked in too much heat, dehydration, this cocktail of everything. But it certainly got mainstream attention, I remember at the time, and there was a lot of outrage about it. And I'm pretty sure that was one of the major catalysts for taking something that otherwise was fairly easily accessible and just coming down with the hammer and saying, no more of this stuff. I'm oversimplifying it for sure, but I remember that specifically.
Yeah, and I think that is often what will happen because you could argue, oh, well, there are plenty of other examples of that, but there hasn't been enough media attention around the downsides. And
Mm.
the pushback that people will say is, well, the supplement industry isn't regulated either. Like, what's the difference? And it's true. The supplement industry should be regulated to a
Mm.
better extent than it is, but it's kind of a straw man argument because within the supplement world, you're talking about something that either comes from food or is a food grade product versus these synthetic drugs that are manufactured in a lab.
All right, pivot. Is there any evidence to suggest that muscle building is any different for women than men? Mechanisms, outcomes, you name it.
No, the primary difference is your baseline muscle pre-training, and that there are sex differences there. So
Mm,
when I say you can build muscle at a similar relative rate, that's
mhm,
relative to your starting point. So, if you and I have never lifted weights, you are going to be bigger and stronger than I am.
mhm.
And that's because men go through puberty, and the increase in testosterone during puberty coincides with an increase in muscle mass. But once we start lifting weights, then we gain muscle similarly relative to our starting point. And even at the molecular level, when we look at muscle, there are no differences in the way that protein synthesis works in response to exercise. And we can talk about these subtle fiber type differences, but a lot of the differences in all of the sex-based differences that exist before we start exercising start to disappear with training.
So you mentioned the fiber types. I know you posted something about this because I would have thought, I probably held the belief that there would have been some notable difference in fiber type between men and women. And now I'm comfortable saying that there's probably way bigger differences across individuals than there are across sexes. Do you want to speak to the fiber type?
Yeah, so I think everyone really speaks with a lot of confidence and simplicity around fiber type. So if I can just first say it's a
Mhm.
lot more complicated. The measurement of it, when we take a muscle biopsy, we're getting 50 to 100 milligrams of muscle from one single site in one single muscle. And then we're trying to make a lot of assumptions about all of the muscle, right? So it's a very powerful tool to have the muscle biopsy, but there are some limitations. There's also various ways to assess fiber type. And when I say fiber type, a muscle fiber is a muscle cell, and it's distinct from other cells because it's kind of long and cylindrical. And maybe in your biology class, you think of a cell as being a circle. So when you actually tease out individual fibers under microscope, they look like really uh, thin strands of hair. That's the kind of texture consistency. So you can either so the fiber type is the protein or one of the proteins that's expressed by the cell. And so when we describe it as more slow twitch or type 1, it's that cell expressing this type 1 protein.
Mhm.
And then we have the fast twitch, or those cells are expressing that type 2 protein. But the fibers really live on this spectrum from slow to fast because we can even have proteins that or cells that express both,
Mhm.
more than one. And those are hybrids. And depending on the analysis that you use, sometimes you don't identify the hybrids. So I say all this backstory to say, when we look at the sex differences, there was a recent meta-analysis that came out, and they reported that women had slightly more type 1 and men had slightly more type 2. But the differences were extremely subtle. We're talking like 51% to 49%-ish. And they did not account for hybrids. They just tried to separate the bucket of type 1 and type 2. And if you don't measure those hybrids, then they are mislabeled, mischaracterized as pure. And what we know about hybrid fibers is the more sedentary you are, the more likely you are to have more hybrid fibers. Or if you look at muscle in disease populations, there's going to be more hybrid fibers. So there's a lot of differences at the individual level, but it is these fibers can transition based on the type of training that you
Mhm.
do. So if we look at a twin study, for example, there's at their identical, right? And so you would say, is this, your classic like nature nurture example? The twin who performed endurance um, training and competed in marathons for decades had an extremely high percentage of type 1 fibers, like 90% type 1. The twin who was a truck driver and never really did any form of structured exercise had 40-ish% type 1, 40-ish% type 2, and the rest were hybrid fibers. So that's a compelling example of two people that likely started at the same place, and then the adaptations were extremely divergent based on the type of training or lack thereof.
Okay, that actually makes a ton of sense. So what you choose to participate in, I think we can comfortably say there are certain phenotypes, like physical presentations of bodies that will gravitate to certain sports. And Michael Phelps is a great example of someone who's probably just genetically engineered to be a great swimmer. But at the same time, the fact that he trained maniacally, probably from a fairly young age, to be a great swimmer manifested as such. Height in basketball players is the easy and obvious example of this stuff. Uh, I think a lot of people, I'm trying to remember the book. I feel like it's The Talent Code, but there's a sort of a misconception that a lot of localized regions of the world, I think Kenyan long distance runners, that it's something, genetic about them. But I think that's more or less been debunked. It just that's what they end up doing with high level coaching at a fairly young age. Now, I've said twice something about like doing it young. There's also the narrative about early specialization that's largely been debunked, and I think it's David Epstein's Range is a good book that sort of debunks that as well. But I'm now comfortable in saying that it's probably less genetic predetermination and more about what someone's interested in. But yes, I think there are some phenotypal features, again, basketball players and height, that can easily have someone gravitate to certain sports and be rewarded for it. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, we in order to really properly answer these questions, we would need to start doing a lot of work in
Mhm.
kids that might
Yeah.
might not get approved by ethics boards. So we are left to sort of speculate,
Mhm.
but with certainly the type of training you do and the adaptations you see at the muscle level, elite endurance athletes have more type 1
Mhm.
fibers, which is what we would expect. And elite strength and power athletes have more type 2 fibers, which is, again, what we would expect. And there aren't sex differences.
Mhm.
I did some work with Andy Galpin maybe 9 years ago or something, and looking at elite Olympic weightlifters, and there were men and women, and there were no sex differences there. And in fact, the highest percentage I think we recorded was in the 70s of type 2 fibers was a woman. And so what we're seeing is, athlete caliber is likely more of the factor than
Mhm.
sex per se.
I'll get back to my guest in a moment. I have cool news. I will be appearing at the King Kong booth at the Arnold Sports Festival in Columbus, Ohio, March 6th and 7th. And I'm fanatical about King Kong backpacks and duffels. They are the best quality bags. I'm long done with buying a new cheap gym bag every 6 months when the last one falls apart. My biggest problem is needing to pick between my Conquer backpack, my waxed canvas core backpack, my Plus duffel, sorry, it's downstairs. My Heritage leather. This thing is so classic. It looks gorgeous. And my Edge backpack. Sorry, you guys can't even get this one anymore. And I always have one of them with me wherever I go, the gym, work, all my travel. I rarely use traditional suitcases anymore, and the convenience is unmatched. And you can save 15% on all your orders. Go to www.knkg.com/Andrew59676. That's www.knkg.com/Andrew59676. Don't worry, just go to the show notes, the link's in there. And I hope to meet you in person at the King Kong booth at the Arnold Sports Festival.
What about birth control? Is there any influence on birth control and muscle growth?
The data we have is mostly on oral contraceptive pills,
Mm.
and there's enough there to say, on average, it's not beneficial nor detrimental for strength, hypertrophy, and power.
Is there any difference in protein timing needs? This one pops up sometimes with, some claims on social media for muscle growth in men and women. It doesn't make sense to me why there would be, but
No, I mean, the protein metabolism is very similar between the sexes, and that, post-exercise anabolic window or the elevation of
mm,
protein synthesis that makes us more sensitive to actually using the amino acids that we consume remains elevated for almost 24 hours. Not that you shouldn't eat for 24 hours, but the point that, you must eat within 30 minutes, it's not true. Overall protein intake is what matters.
yep. I've always said, people ask this constantly. It's still a very pervasive belief, especially with, people who are not like heavily immersed in fitness the way we are. The anabolic window. And I always say, there's no reason, like you said, not to eat post-workout. And I find that it can actually be a very effective habit. But if you've eaten shortly within before the start of the workout, you're fine for a while. Like, listen, I'm still someone who has a post-workout shake. I find it's actually a really effective reminder to get enough protein to meet my daily goals. It's just an efficient habit for me, but I know that I do not need it. And if I miss it, I'm not going to waste my gains.
Yeah, well said. I think in order to implement strategies that help us meet our overall protein intake goal, then that requires consuming protein more than once a day. And so if we want to make it a habit, like you said, to have a post-workout shake, then that's totally fine. But it's not this sort of magic where if you skip that, then your workout was a waste of time.
And it's also a habit for me to remember to take my creatine as well, because I put it in my protein shake. Now, you actually just put out a post, and I've seen this back and forth, but it's like the what's your take based on what the evidence says about how effective creatine is?
We have a wealth of data showing the effects for strength and sprint performance. It's that high intensity exercise where having creatine supplementation, it might give you a boost. But we're talking, an extra rep or two on your set, or maybe a half a second off your sprint, not really compelling muscularity or strength changes. And certainly, if you're not actually doing the exercise, then you're not capitalizing on what the creatine supplementation can do for you. So I'm seeing a lot of messaging that everyone should be taking creatine. And I think it's safe and it works, but the effects are small. And all the chatter about sleep deprivation and cognitive decline and the brain and clinical depression, that is really leaning on very preliminary data in clinical populations that may have a brain creatine deficit. So somebody with a traumatic brain injury, someone who is extremely sleep deprived, I mean, has been up for 21 hours, or patients that already have Alzheimer's disease. These are small pilot studies that are interesting. That would be cool if creatine was effective in these clinical populations. But people are twisting that to present creatine as this cognitive boosting supplement or creatine as a prevention for Alzheimer's or dementia, and that data is not at all there.
It's more stay tuned, hope for the best. There's not much, I'm not confident there's really much downside with creatine. Maybe if someone whose budget is really, really tight, where the cost of adding it in. But as supplements go, creatine still historically, even though the price has gone up a lot the last few years, it's pretty affordable. And you just need creatine monohydrate. You don't need the fancy extra branded stuff. They mechanistically, they just cannot do anything better or different.
Yeah, and the only caveat that I would give there is in some of these preliminary studies, the patients were taking really high doses.
Hmm.
Instead of your kind of typical 5 grams per day, they were taking 10, 20 grams per day. And when people take doses at that level, sometimes you can get some GI issues. So I would just stick to the 5 grams.
Sounds good. All right. Is there any association between testosterone levels and lean mass and strength in women? And let me preface that with it natural and normal physiological ranges.
That's really the key point. And whenever I talk about this, somebody comes in and says, well, what about bodybuilders who are using? And so when we're getting outside those normal ranges, when we are in these, we say super physiological levels, like this isn't what we would get with normal physiology. And yes, testosterone works if you are using exogenous testosterone. It will make you bigger, it'll make you stronger. But when we look at testosterone within the normal ranges, it's not predictive of your hypertrophic response to training. So we don't really see that relationship. With the caveat that, if you're a man, for example, who's had a certain testosterone level for a long time and that's your normal, and then you see a drop, then, perhaps that would you notice an effect on performance in the gym. But it's really about your normal level, and what is normal is a really, really broad range. So as long as you're
Mm.
kind of within that normal range and it's your normal, then we're not seeing a relationship or kind of a predictability of testosterone levels and how you would respond to training.
I've understood this for quite a while. This is not new research, and yet it's almost one of the most counterintuitive things out there. Because for a very long time, I would have thought, oh, like if you increase testosterone, but it's within normal physiological ranges, this would have to have benefits. Or I think to what you said there too, it's not like the answer is, all right, let's go get some TRT. The answer might be, all right, is there an issue with sleep? Is there an issue with vitamin D consumption or some other precursor to the synthesizing of testosterone? Can we look at the lifestyle factors there? And then if we could address those, we may just see, some improvement in natural testosterone. And one thing I'll say for sure is natural test boosters, anything over the counter in supplement stores, is a complete waste of your money, guys. Please do not.
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point there because people really, really focus on testosterone in and of itself. And when we think about those sm subtle changes that are again within the normal range, if testosterone was that potent a driver of growth, then we wouldn't see what I said before about those similar relative gains between the sexes. So
Mm,
it affects baseline muscularity, but those circulating
mm.
testosterone is not the primary driver of growth, which is what people thought at one point that there are all these
Hmm.
programs out there, like acutely boosting testosterone post workout is going to be better, and it just doesn't pan out.
And I remember when I first started lifting, one of the narratives was that you needed to do the big compounds like squats and deadlifts because they would acutely increase testosterone and GH levels, which would actually then have a global effect on your muscle hypertrophy, which for we've now known for a long time that doesn't do anything whatsoever. So transient spikes do not contribute to improved muscle growth.
Right.
Hmm. Fascinating stuff. What about does menopause accelerate muscle loss?
A quick sponsor break for my current aspiring coach listeners. This episode is brought to you by Train Heroic. If you know me, you know I only work with sponsors I use personally and where I know the people behind the product. Train Heroic is the best online coaching software in the industry. Not only is it a great platform for one-on-one coaching, it's fantastic for group coaching and selling standalone programs. Train Heroic is used by some of my trusted friends, so I switched my online group program here, and my members love it, raving about its ease of use. Having a dedicated app means far greater reliability for my clients and has been by far my best experience with any online coaching software. Train Heroic is a proven and stable industry leader, meaning it isn't going to suddenly disappear. One of the biggest risks in choosing an online coaching software. When you start a free trial today, you'll get 90 days free to experience why I love and trust this platform. You'll get full support from their team, who've been a joy for me to work with. And I trust Train Heroic and the people behind it. Here's how to activate your free 90-day trial. It's 2 important steps. Number 1, go to www.trainheroic.com/liftfree. Step 2, reply to the email you get. It should be trials@trainheroic.com, and let them know I sent you, or go to the links in the show notes.
I want to take one more thing about testosterone if I
Please,
can.
please.
The interesting thing about testosterone is the way that it's measured clinically is different from the way that it's measured in research. And in clinical settings, the goal is usually to look for outside the normal range. So in women, it's like, is it high? And in men, it's usually, is it low? And so these tests are not very good at giving you an accurate number because it's more about looking at the ranges.
Mm.
And so they're using this, they're called an immunoassay, and they're very, very common. They're the most common type of clinical assay because they're fairly inexpensive and they're quick. And the type of analysis that you do in a research setting is a lot more complicated, a lot more expensive, and it uses specialized equipment. So the example that I would give is like an immunoassay would say, okay, is that drug in your system? But it wouldn't necessarily say how much of that drug is in your system. You'd have to go on to do another analysis. And so a lot of the kind of freaking out about getting one testosterone level measured and then rechecking it in 6 months and oh, it's up 50 or down 30, a lot of that could be due to just the inherent error in that assay.
That actually brings up another thought adjacent. Are there things that can result in women having higher than what we would consider to be the normal physiological range of testosterone? Perhaps PCOS is something I hear about. Is that true? Is that possible?
That's true. I mean, it's one of the criteria for diagnosing PCOS.
And then because if we're getting testosterone above the normal physiological ranges for women, does that actually have any effects, anabolic or side effects?
It can. Well, the research on this is fairly poor, because the lived
Mm,
experience of women with PCOS is really diverse. And
mm,
in a research setting, we're trying to control everything.
mm.
And so in my research, for example, we excluded women with PCOS and endometriosis because that introduces a variable that we're trying to remove variables in science. So we need more work in that area. But there are definitely people who would hypothesize that if you have PCOS, you might have athletic performance improvements. And there are anecdotal reports of that, how many female athletes have PCOS, but we don't really have great data, to be honest.
I can definitely think of anecdotal examples in my world where it holds up. Something you said, and I really want to reiterate this, and I've gotten this from so many places. I'll give a shout out to my friend Molly Galbraith and Girl Scouts Strong. They have a menopause certification. Molly sent me this Menopause Plus. It's sort of an extension of it's just a book that I happen to have really nearby. But for all of the science, what have you, like the variance between women's experience is huge, and that still is the biggest thing. I just tagged you in something. I know that Menu Henselman's just put up a slide, and it was, you know what? I apologize. I really do need to pull this up and read it. Um, guys, you guys listening, I don't like having my phone out here. Menno, where are you? So the headline went, uh, where is it? Shit. Okay. The menstrual cycle does not affect gym strength, new study finds. And I don't even know if that's necessarily new. It's just there's a new study. And this is speaks to something we've talked about before, and I've talked with Dr. Alyssa Olenek. It's you don't need to cycle sync your training, you don't need to adjust it. Just as a global data set, this just doesn't hold up. But the women in the comments, it's like you need to talk to women's experience because so many of them have noticed that they feel differently. So the research is not saying to these women, you're wrong and that there's no difference. It's just this is something that we see across populations. Your unique experience still matters. And if you do need to auto-regulate your training across your month, then that's perfectly fine to do. It's just that there is no global that all women need to do this based on research.
Exactly. The message should be there are no predictable, phase-based changes in your physiology that require you to change how you exercise or the intensity in which you exercise. There, and that's important to I think that should be an empowering thing for people to hear,
Mm,
because if I were to say, oh well, your testosterone, your estrogen is high and therefore you must train this way, or oh, progesterone's high in this week, so you should not do any high intensity training. That's really putting a lot of restrictions
mm.
that are solely due to the hormone profile. And I think it should be liberating for women to hear that they can just follow their own patterns and auto-regulate and adjust as needed, instead of being kind of stuck in this, you are a woman and you have a menstrual cycle and therefore follow this prescription.
And I talked about this with Alyssa Oletic recently, but do you think part of it is the people who are messaging and saying talking about cycle syncing, and then a woman who's had an experience that, hey, this validates, this like aligns with my identity, this has been my experience. And then when someone comes around like you who is taking this the actual like data, what's out there, the peer-reviewed research, and is saying, well, no, this is not true, then those women are clutching firmly to what feels like part of their identity. It's like something's being ripped away. Can you speak to that? What's going on there?
Well, cycle syncing and similar narratives that speak to women and say, I hear you, there's the problem that we need to
Mm,
fix, and I have a solution for you, and I'm not going to be dismissive of you the way all these
mm,
other programs or solutions that came before. That really resonates with people. It's a very compelling marketing pitch, because you hear that and you think, well, this must be better because it's tailored to somebody like me. Unfortunately, when people get deeply entrenched in something that is marketable and successful and lucrative, then they aren't incentivized to evolve with the science and say, oh, well, maybe that hypothesis sort of made sense. There was a reason why we should study it, but we've studied it and we're now seeing that that idea isn't necessarily helpful, and in fact could be detrimental if you arbitrarily tell women to start slashing their volume in half or down by 30% or whatever. So it's really, really unfortunate, because I understand why the messaging resonates with people. Women want to feel seen and heard and understood and spoken to, but a lot of people and companies are taking advantage of that and coming in and selling or promoting ineffective programs and supplements and diets specifically to women.
we've seen this phenomenon in the diet space as well, the nutrition books. So there's been a number of books written by semi-famous people on low carb, on the carb insulin hypothesis, on fasting. And the research has just not borne out. In fact, these things have been largely debunked as having done anything special outside of the effects of calories in, calories out. But of course, the person who has struggled with dietary adherence, maybe eaten too much ultra processed, high calorie, and high refined carbohydrate food, all of a sudden reads this, there's a compelling narrative, and then cuts out their carbs, starts fasting a bit, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, I'm losing weight. I've tried everything else before. This finally worked. Therefore, fasting must be special. Low carb must be special. It's like, no, you found something that actually got you, and it probably wasn't even a sustainable thing. I bet you any money if you track the data on these people and see how adherent they were over the long run, it probably wasn't very good. But they noticed that, well, I lost weight because I went and did these things. You lost weight because you found a system that you, at least for a little while, brought yourself into a calorie deficit. You lost body fat, your metabolic health improved, therefore, right? So I understand why these narratives are powerful.
Yeah, and if you think about the flip side, for you to say, you have all these options and there's a lot of flexibility and nuance and we need individualization, that is not selling. People don't want to hear that. People want the answer, and they want to know what works and what I should be doing. I get questions all the time, I am a 48-year-old woman, what kind of exercise should I be doing? I'm like, you're asking the wrong question, because we need to design exercise programs that are effective and appropriate for you and your individual goals. And you can have different goals at any age or any sex. There isn't some magic must do program for women or for women of a certain age. And people just think there must be because they're inundated with that message.
In theory, if the goals were the same as a 21-year-old guy, they could probably have a nearly identical program to the 21-year-old guy. Now, what will matter in this scenario? The injury history and orthopedic status of someone who's 48 versus 21. That is probably going to be different. That matters absolutely. The recovery capacity of a 48-year-old versus a 21-year-old will also be different. So that may go into volume. And then there's a training age. If the 21-year-old has been lifting for 5 years and the 48-year-old is just starting, well, then you have to graduate your load, intensity, volume, so that way it manages your injury risk, right? Build it up. Those things matter. The actual fact that someone's a woman or the age itself doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and I mean, I've coached men and women who could handle insane amounts of volume, volume that I could never recover from on a weekly basis. And I've coached other people who are on the other end of that spectrum. And so there's a lot of individualization in how much volume you can handle before the wheels start to fall off.
And anecdotally, I'll say this is something that we've noticed, like there's like narrow anecdotes, and then there's anecdotes that are so broad we'd almost treat them as if it's data. Whereas like women seem to, there's a self-selection bias too, but they can often handle volumes and rest break, like short rest breaks and intensities in training that will crush men. There is an argument that on average, men being larger, stronger, having more muscle, as we started this conversation with, then the absolute loads that they're using are probably heavier, and therefore the actual absolute load, even regardless of relative strength, the absolute load, and I've experienced this at a certain point, shit's just heavy. And that stuff, you just feel it. So it takes longer to recover from. So I think there's that. I think there's a bit of self-selection bias, the way that women like to train. Um, but yeah, I've definitely noticed it anecdotally that like my women on average tend to be able to recover a little quicker between sets. They like to superset more. They tend to thrive on it. They're just little motors.
Yeah, I've heard that from other coaches too. And I'm of the mindset that the absolute load is an important factor
Hmm.
because when we think about some compound exercises, they're just beating you up in ways that are not muscle specific.
Mm.
And so even if there isn't something, because that was the hypothesis that there's something about, fiber type differences or estrogen receptors, or it's something sex based that it would
Mm.
explain the difference. And that data isn't there. We don't see that there is like a recoverability at the muscle level that differs based on sex. But when we look at the kind of real life practical factors, it really might be the appropriate explanation for that observation.
I suspect so. Okay, vibration plate training. It's popping up again. I remember this company I used to work for. One of the locations had a special room, trainer only. Some of the trainers get certified in using these vibration plates. And it's like, oh, this is like fads come around. Uh, what are the popular claims that this does? I know that lymphatic drainage, bone density are some of the ones in there. Is there any benefit here?
It's funny because I remember vibration plates at my gym when I was working as a trainer and group fitness instructor, and I never saw a single person use them. There was like the corner of the gym that just sits there and gets dusty. They're back and they're being marketed for at-home use. So they're these kind of smaller devices that you can order online and use at home. And they might have utility in clinical populations or rehab settings where people are not able to perform exercise in a more traditional way.
Hmm.
But the fact that people are promoting these that you can kind of swap it out for other forms of exercise, no. That data is not there. And these vibration plates also have load limits. And so a lot of them are
Hmm.
actually going to limit you from the absolute, even if you were trying to squat on it or something like that. So for that reason, I would skip them as well. And all the claims about lymphatic drainage come from the idea that when we exercise, we see an increase in blood flow. And yes, standing on the vibration plate might increase blood flow, but so does going for a walk or going for a run or lifting weights.
That makes sense. You had me picturing someone like, and these machines can actually be big and heavy, like pulling it up into a squat rack because you're not going to pull the squat rack over onto the vibration plate to like some of the barbell squat of these things. It's, while not the same, it suffers from the same problem as unstable surface training, right? You're going to get, in almost all cases, more benefit from like loading heavier, and challenging, making, something that's actually progressively overloading to near failure that actually creates stimulus for muscles to grow and get stronger than to artificially limit it. So yeah, to me, logically, it just doesn't make sense. And I think we can go back to, I think, what you see these old videos of these old gyms and women will be in these machines that will vibrate them as if it's going to like get rid of their fat. It's kind of the same idea, isn't it?
It is. I've seen people who claim that the vibration plate is going to get rid of your cellulite, and it's not.
All right. Let's circle back to the menstrual cycle stuff. Are there any differences in injury risk across phases of the menstrual cycle? And I believe that this claim is predicated on maybe differences in the hormones and flexibility, joint laxity during the phases.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in this, and injury studies are really challenging to do because you're just looking retrospectively, right?
Mm.
So there's a lot of limitations when you're looking back and what data do we have? Because people get injured for a variety of reasons under a variety of circumstances. It's very difficult to say, oh, I'm going to point to this one thing, right? And so the tendency to blame the menstrual cycle in female athletes is problematic in my mind because, and I'll get to the data, it is giving some of these coaches an out because instead of saying, let's look at your training program, let's look at how much volume you're doing, let's look at your sports specific versus not sports specific training, let's look at your nutrition, what were we doing for recovery, and how can we manage all of those factors. Instead of that, it's she's a female athlete and she got injured. It must be the menstrual cycle.
Hmm.
And I don't like that because the data shows, again, retrospective analyses. There's one paper reporting more injury incidents in the
Hmm.
late follicular phase. So that's when we have peak levels of estrogen. There's one study that reports greatest injury risk in the late luteal phase. So that's when their progesterone peaked and now it's coming down. Estrogen peaked again and now it's coming down. So very different hormone profile. And then there are three papers that found no difference between phases. So that to me is not very compelling because we're not even leaning in one direction or another. And there are various limitations with these studies again because you're looking back at okay, how many people got injured, how many times, and then were you tracking your menstrual cycle and do you have it in a phone app and then can we
Hmm.
estimate what phase you're in? So the quality of the data is pretty poor. But I think even if we got to a point where we saw some trend in one phase or another that we could point to hormones, what do you do with that? And I
Hmm.
imagine we would go back to, okay, well, we're going to really focus on managing all those important factors like your training volume and your nutrition and your recovery and your sleep.
Makes sense. You got me thinking. So I've been talking to Annie Short, and she's the hypermobile strength coach. So I've been talking about getting her on here, and she's an expert in, again, hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos, and the hypermobility is something that's getting a little bit more attention. And so there's a bit of extension here, but I actually am looking forward to learning more about, some of the what she'll have to say about the injury risk and just training considerations. I mean, I deal with a fair number of clients who have hypermobility. They're almost exclusively women. Sometimes you get men who are, and there's just certain common sense things you do. Like I don't go out of my way to have people lock out their knees on a leg press to begin with, but if someone's not hypermobile, it's not a concern. If someone is hypermobile, yes, very careful because leg press in particular is one of the ways that we can most artificially load the heaviest based on the way that the machine works. So would I think that am I comfortable saying that we increase the injury risk of someone if we have them hard lock out their knees if they're hypermobile on a leg press? I would be comfortable saying yes. I think we're presenting the risk of something very catastrophic. You see those horrible gym videos or whatever. I just don't like creating fear around it. And I think it's true of almost anybody with hypermobility at that joint is you want to be careful about how they control the lockout, how you're using load, but train them to actually be strong around that position. So that it comes back to if an individual during their cycle notices that they simply are more hypermobile, more flexible at that phase, then just the practical application would be just to be careful about end ranges. I think it's just probably wise anyway, right?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with the joint laxity hypothesis just because
Fair.
it feels really similar as the protein synthesis and strength hypotheses,
Mm,
where we're saying this very short-term hormone fluctuation, a couple
mm,
of days, is going to have meaningfully noticeable effects on performance, on joints and tendons and like I think about the magnitude of the change you would need for it
mhm.
to manifest in a practical way.
So someone's probably already fairly hypermobile anyway, right? It's probably not shifting them from not being to being. Okay, that makes total sense. Good. Okay, here's a great quote, and I think this is a good place to finish up here. Because I know you've been getting a lot of pushback because you've been debunking a lot of stuff, and therefore there are, as we've talked about, there are people who've built a foundation on the ideas that you're actually taking the research going, hey, this stuff isn't holding up based on research, this stuff is not true. So, quote, misinformation and fear mongering confuses women. It's harmful. Calling it out isn't putting other women down. It's not mean girl behavior. End quote. You want to talk about this?
Yeah, I see a trend for, and it's not just with me, it's in many people who post about the popular folks who put out messages that are misleading, are fear-mongering, are confusing. And then by coming out and correcting it, the comments will be, why are you tearing other women down? Women should support women. And I don't understand that particular sentiment because if somebody is lying to you and misleading you, you should be offended. They're lying to you. They're taking advantage of you for their own financial gain. And for somebody like me to come along and point out that this set of facts isn't actually supported by the science, I'm trying to do you a favor. I'm trying to help you out and say, don't be misled. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your money. Don't waste your effort worrying about this thing. And it's not mean girl behavior. We should hold men and women accountable for what they say. And if somebody is being a grifter, then we need to try to stop them or at least alert the public that this is not evidence-based information. And the thing I see more and more and more is people are misleading and using science to do it. So
Mm,
we're saying, this is a scientific claim, or here's my PubMed ID, and what we know, and that they'll try to make a claim that sounds incredibly complicated, just to say, like, look how smart I am. Look at the big words I used, and then you'll say, oh, okay, I should take their word for it. They really sound like they know what they're talking about.
mm. It is funny because this thing is kind of unique. I'm sure it's popped up with men, but like it almost exclusively seems to be a pushback against someone like yourself, a woman, going at the claims of other women. Fascinating. And I get part of it too is wouldn't the rebuttal be evidence to support the original claim, right? As opposed to having to lean on this narrative. It's to me, it's evidence that, okay, you don't have anything to support the original claim. Now, usually it's not even necessarily the person you're rebutting coming back at you. It's usually their supporters in the comments who are complaining. And so it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier. I think in a lot of cases, these people revere, they look up to some person they have a parasocial relationship with. This person is saying the things that validates their experience, and you are coming along and you're the threat. You're the person who's saying this thing that is making me feel heard. Well, it's not true.
Yeah, and I think people feel that having a female specific message or program or general guidelines, that's somehow really empowering for women. But it's disempowering if it's not true.
Mm.
And if I come along, and the problem is the people who are doing this successfully, they know enough to sound credible. And sometimes they have the credentials that certainly make them seem credible. But when y- women are, when anyone, but if we're talking specifically about women, are confused and misled, then they end up it ends up being harmful. I get messages from people saying I followed that advice and I hurt myself, or I gained a bunch of weight because somebody told me that a calorie deficit didn't work and I had to fuel myself appropriately. Or, well, I tried cycle syncing and then I stopped getting results because I was doing so much less work. So the results of this, it's not just that it's dishonest, it's that you could actually end up leading people in a direction that takes them longer to reach their goals or holds them back from working towards those goals because everything is so confusing and so complicated and therefore unsustainable. And so the end results of people promoting this kind of ineffective, overly complicated messaging can be harmful. It's not harmless. And it's certainly not evidence-based. And that's where I come in because I think it's offensive when people say that something is scientific and it's not.
I love it. I've been loving your media. I love your messaging. You're one of my favorite follows. It's why I wanted to bring you back. You will be back again because, as as you said off air, there are so many of these crazy claims. We just like keep piling them up, so we'll have to go through another one. Uh, Everybody can follow you at Dr. Lauren CS1 on Instagram. You'll be an easy find anyway. What other resources do you want to point people to? Obviously, mass.
Yeah, if you're interested in kind of long form content, I mean, of that's evidence-based but topical, we cover a wide variety of health and fitness topics in Mass, and you'll get 9 or so articles every month. So that's massresearchreview.com.
Wonderful podcast.
Front Page Fitness, my friend Eric Trexler and I just shoot the shit and laugh at uh, fitness related headlines, but we provide you with some good information along the way. But it's
Eric
light.
is Eric is fantastic. He's brilliant. I mean, you're just surrounded by and working with some of the best people in the industry. It's like get Dr. Eric Helms, Dr. Stu Phillips. You mentioned Dr. Andy Galpin earlier on. Dr. Eric Trexler. Uh, I know Greg Knuckles has been sort of in the mix as well. So these are just like a small subsection of the people that you've been actively working with and collaborating. And these are some of the most reputable evidence-based figures in the entire industry. So everybody listening, I would love for you to take every one of my episodes and share it to your world. But if I had to pick one and one person, please take this episode, share it with people in your world, the coaches, the women who are interested in fitness, hell, the guys even, and just get this out in more hands. Share Lauren. Go support her, please. There's a good quest here. So thank you. I appreciate you coming on, taking the time.
Thank you.